The knife stopped. The Gestapo officer had sliced through 40 centimeters of crust when his blade caught on something that should not exist inside bread. He pulled it out slowly. A sheet of silk, thinner than cigarette paper, printed with roads and rail lines across occupied France. He held it up to the window light. The baker stood 3 meters away, flour on his hands, watching the silk turn his life into evidence. Henri Beaumont's throat closed. His vision collapsed into a tunnel with the silk map at the end. 3 drops of urine soaked into his trousers. His lungs forgot how to pull air. The officer turned toward him, and Henri's knees unlocked. He did not fall. He stood. He watched the officer study the map, tracing the red dots with one finger, counting them. 12 dots, 12 safe houses, 12 families who would die if Henri spoke. For 18 months, the system had worked perfectly. Henri baked 200 loaves per week for the German garrison. The soldiers ate his bread warm, paid in Reichsmarks, and joked with his apprentices. 63 loaves had carried silk maps baked into the dough. 63 Allied prisoners had walked out of France using routes printed on fabric that survived 190-degree ovens. The maps had passed through German hands, German kitchens, and German inspection tables without detection. No one suspected. No one searched. Bread was too ordinary, too essential, too visible to hide anything. Until March 12, 1944, when someone told the Gestapo where to look. The officer placed the silk on the counter and asked Henri a question in German. Henri did not understand German. He understood only that his wife was in the front room, that the officer's hand was moving toward his holster, and that every second of silence made him look more guilty. His mouth opened. No sound came out. The officer asked again. Henri heard his own heartbeat in his ears, 140 beats per minute. So loud he thought the officer could hear it too.
How does a 52-year-old baker with arthritis in both wrists become the most prolific escape architect in Normandy? How does he hide silk inside fire without burning it, tearing it, or leaving a seam? And how does a man who saved 54 lives die believing his family will think he was a traitor? October 3rd, 1942. 3 knocks on the back door of the bakery. Sharp, deliberate, spaced 2 seconds apart. Henri Beaumont was shaping baguettes in the back room when he heard them. It was 22:30. The bakery had been closed for 3 hours. The German garrison was 200 meters away. No one knocked on bakery doors at 22:30 unless they were lost, drunk, or running from something. Henri wiped flour from his hands and walked to the door. His wife, Marguerite, looked up from the account books and said nothing. She knew that knock. She had heard it once before, in 1917, when her brother had deserted from the front and spent 2 nights in their cellar before the military police found him. That knock meant someone was in trouble. It meant a choice was coming. Henri opened the door 6 centimeters and looked through the gap. A man stood in the alley, thin, unshaven, wearing a jacket 2 sizes too large and trousers held up with rope. His boots were wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound of walking. His face was pale. His eyes were moving too fast, scanning the street behind him every 2 seconds. He looked at Henri and said 4 words in English. Henri did not speak English, but he recognized the accent. British, RAF, probably. Shot down, probably. Running, definitely. Henri stood in the doorway for 4 seconds. 4 seconds where his brain divided the future into 2 paths. Path 1, close the door, lock it, go back to shaping baguettes, pretend he heard nothing. The man would leave. He would try another house. He would be caught within 24 hours and executed, but Henri would not be responsible. Path 2, open the door, pull the man inside, hide him, feed him, give him papers and a map, and risk execution for himself, his wife, and his 2 apprentices. The penalty for aiding enemy soldiers was firing squad. No trial,
No appeal. The Germans had posted the order on every street corner in Falaise. 4 seconds. Henri could hear the man breathing. Fast, shallow, the rhythm of someone who had been walking for days without sleep. He could smell him too. Sweat, dirt, wet wool, fear. The man's hand was shaking. He was 24, maybe 25 years old. Henri thought about his own son, who would have been 26, if he had not died of typhoid in 1938. He opened the door and pulled the man inside. The man stumbled forward and Henri caught him by the elbow. He was lighter than he looked, maybe 60 kilograms. Henri locked the door, turned off the hallway light, and led him into the back room. Marguerite stood up from her desk and looked at the man. She did not ask questions. She walked to the cupboard, pulled out a loaf of bread and a jar of preserved apples, and placed them on the table. The man sat down and ate without speaking. He ate like someone who had not seen food in a week. He did not chew. He swallowed. Henri watched him eat and realized he had no plan. He did not speak English. He did not know where the man needed to go. He did not know how to forge papers or find resistance contacts. He knew how to bake bread. That was all. He had inherited the bakery from his father in 1910, after his father died of pneumonia. For 32 years he had baked bread, 6 days a week, 200 loaves per day, 1,200 loaves per week. He knew dough. He knew fermentation, hydration, gluten structure, and oven temperature. He knew that rye dough needed 18 hours to rise and that butter lamination failed above 24 degrees Celsius. He could shape 80 baguettes per hour and judge fermentation time by pressing his fingertip into dough and feeling the resistance. But he did not know how to save a British pilot. The man finished eating and looked at Henri. He said something in English and pointed south. Henri understood. Spanish border, 800 kilometers away. Neutral territory, freedom. The man needed a map, civilian papers, and money. Henri had none of those things, but he knew someone who might. There was a woman in Falaise named Simone Leclerc who worked as a school teacher and sometimes visited the bakery to buy bread. She always paid in coins, never Reichsmarks, and she always asked for yesterday's bread, which was cheaper. 2 months earlier, in August 1942, she had knocked on the back door at midnight and asked Henri if he had any extra flour to sell. He did not. She had thanked him, left, and never mentioned the visit again. Henri had thought it was strange. No one buys flour at midnight. No one knocks on the back door to ask for it, unless they were testing him. Henri told the man to wait. He walked upstairs, woke his apprentice Luc, and sent him to Simone's house with a message. British pilot, needs papers and route, bakery back door, now. Luc left without asking questions. He was 16 years old and had been working in the bakery since he was 12. He knew when to stay silent. Simone arrived 40 minutes later. She did not look surprised. She looked at the pilot, asked him 3 questions in English, and nodded. She turned to Henri and asked if he could keep the man hidden for 2 days while she arranged papers. Henri said yes. She asked if he understood the risk. Henri said yes. She looked at him for 5 seconds, studying his face, deciding whether he was serious or stupid. Then she said, "If you do this once, I will ask you to do it again, and again, until you are caught or the war ends. Do you understand?" Henri understood. She left. The pilot slept in the cellar on a pile of flour sacks. Henri did not sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with Marguerite and calculated risk in fractions. The German garrison was 200 meters away. They inspected his flour stores every Tuesday. They counted his loaves every morning. If they searched the cellar, the pilot would be found. If the pilot was found, Henri would be arrested. If Henri was arrested, Marguerite and Luc would be arrested too. 3 people dead because Henri opened a door. But he had opened it, and now there was no closing it. 2 days later, Simone returned with forged papers, a wool coat, and a hand-drawn map on cigarette paper. The pilot left at 2 o'clock, walking south through fields and hedgerows. Henri locked the door behind him, walked to the kitchen sink, and vomited. His hands shook so hard he could not grip the faucet. Marguerite stood behind him and placed one hand on his back. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. 3 weeks later, Simone knocked on the back door again. She told Henri the pilot had reached Spain. She placed 5 silk handkerchiefs on his table, each one printed with roads, rivers, rail lines, and safe houses across Normandy. She placed a spool of thread next to them. She said, "German prisoners work on road repairs 15 kilometers east of Falaise. If you can pass the maps hidden in bread, they can escape during work details. Can you do that?" Henri looked at the silk. It was thinner than parchment. It tore if you folded it wrong. It disintegrated in water. It would burn at oven temperature. He had no idea how to hide it inside bread without destroying it. He said yes. Simone left. Henri sat at his table and stared at the silk for 20 minutes. He thought about gluten structure, hydration ratios, and lamination techniques. He thought about his father, who had taught him to fold butter into brioche dough without melting it by keeping both materials cold and working fast. He thought about the 9 men who had been executed in the town square 2 weeks earlier for hiding a radio. He thought about his son, dead at 24, who would never grow older than the pilot sleeping in his cellar. Then, he picked up the silk and began to practice. Henri Beaumont had baked bread for 32 years. He had never fought in a war. He had flat feet, arthritis in both wrists, and a hernia from lifting flour sacks. But he understood systems. He understood how to build something fragile inside something strong without breaking either one. He understood that dough was just controlled collapse, a structure held together by tension and time. He understood that if you knew the system well enough, you could hide anything inside it. For the next 18 months, he would prove that. 63 times. Silk, burned at 160 degrees Celsius. Bread, baked at 190. The mathematics did not work. Henri sat at his kitchen table at 2300 on October 20th, 1942, staring at 5 silk handkerchiefs spread across the wood. Each one measured 18 centimeters square, thinner than parchment, printed with roads, rivers, rail lines, and red dots marking safe houses. He touched one with his fingertip. It shifted under the pressure like spider web. He folded it in half. The crease turned white. He unfolded it. The white line remained, a scar in the fabric. One more fold and it would tear. He had 9 days to solve a problem that had no solution. Henri knew dough. He knew that gluten formed long chains when needed, creating elasticity and structure. He knew that yeast produced carbon dioxide during fermentation, inflating the dough like a balloon. He knew that heat above 60 degrees killed yeast, that steam above 100 degrees created crust, and that the Maillard reaction above 140 degrees turned crust brown. He knew temperature, timing, and texture, but he had never tried to hide something inside fire that fire would destroy. Night 1. Henri tried wrapping silk in wax paper. He rolled the paper around the map, sealed the edges with his fingernail, and placed it inside a ball of dough. He shaped the dough into a loaf and let it rise for 2 hours. The dough expanded. The wax paper crinkled inside, creating a visible bulge on one side of the loaf. He baked it anyway. At 12 minutes, he smelled burning wax. At 18 minutes, smoke seeped from a crack in the crust. He pulled the loaf from the oven and sliced it open. The wax had melted at 160 degrees, soaking into the dough and turning it gray. The silk was gone, dissolved into black residue. Failure. Night 2. Henri tried oiling the silk. He brushed olive oil across both sides of the map, hoping the oil would create a barrier between silk and dough. He folded the oiled silk into a small square, placed it between 2 layers of dough, and pinched the edges shut. He baked the loaf at 190 degrees for 35 minutes. When he sliced it open, the silk had survived, but the oil had seeped outward during baking, leaving dark stains across the crust in the exact shape of the hidden map. Anyone looking at the loaf would see the outline. Failure. Night 3. Henri tried sealing the silk between 2 thin sheets of dough, like a sandwich. He rolled the dough flat, placed the silk in the center, covered it with a second sheet, and pressed the edges together with a fork. The seal held during the first rise. It split open during the second. When the dough expanded, the trapped air pushed against the seam until it tore. The silk slid halfway out of the loaf before baking even began. Failure. Night 4. Henri could not sleep. His wrists ached from kneading. His eyes burned from staring at dough under candlelight. Marguerite sat across from him at 2 o'clock and asked if he wanted to stop. He said no. She asked why not. He said because 40 men were waiting in a camp 15 kilometers away, and if he stopped, they would die there. She said nothing. She placed her hand on his and sat with him in silence until dawn. Night 5. Henri remembered his father. It was 1908. Henri was 16 years old, learning to make brioche. His father had shown him a technique called lamination, folding butter into dough without mixing the two. The trick was temperature. Butter melted at 32 degrees. Dough fermented best at 24 degrees. If you kept both materials cold and worked fast, you could fold butter into dough in thin layers, creating a flaky texture without blending them together. The butter stayed solid. The dough stayed separate. Fire turned them into pastry. Henri went to the cellar and placed a silk map on the stone floor. The cellar stayed at 12 degrees year-round. He left the map there for 2 hours until it was cold enough to feel stiff under his fingers. He rolled out a sheet of dough on a floured table, working fast to keep it cool. He placed the chilled silk in the center. He folded the dough over the silk like an envelope. Left side over, right side over, top down, bottom up. He dusted the seams with flour and pressed them flat with his palm. He shaped the dough into a loaf, placed it in a pan, and let it rise for 90 minutes. He baked it at 190 degrees for 35 minutes. At 36 minutes, he pulled the loaf from the oven and placed it on the counter. His hands were shaking. He waited 5 minutes for the loaf to cool. Then he picked up a knife and sliced through the center. The blade cut clean. No resistance, no crinkle of paper, no smell of burning. He pulled the two halves apart. The silk map lay inside, intact. It was browned at the edges, slightly darker than when he had placed it in the dough. The printed roads were visible. The red dots marking safe houses were clear. The fabric had survived 35 minutes at 190 degrees because the dough surrounding it had insulated it, trapping moisture and preventing direct heat from reaching the silk until the final minutes of baking. By then, the crust had formed a protective shell. The map had hidden inside its own shield. Henri sat down. He did not speak. He stared at the map for 3 minutes. Then he baked another loaf. Same technique, same result. Then another and another. By dawn on night 5, he had baked 7 map loaves. 6 succeeded. 1 failed when he folded the silk too sharply, and it tore during shaping. But 6 worked. He had solved fire. The next problem was identification. Henri could not risk a German soldier cutting into a map loaf by accident. The bakery sold 200 loaves per week. 60 loaves went to the German garrison. 40 went to French civilians who worked for the occupation administration. 100 went to families in Falaise. If a map loaf reached the wrong hands, Henri would be executed within 24 hours. He needed a marking system, invisible to everyone except the prisoners, who knew to look for it. Simone had told him the prisoners would be briefed before delivery. They would know to search for a small mark on the bottom crust. But the mark had to look accidental. It could not be a symbol, a letter, or anything that suggested intention. It had to look like damage from rough handling or from the baking process itself. Henri spent night 6 practicing marks. He used a nail to scratch a small cross into the bottom of a test loaf before baking. After baking, the cross was too obvious. It looked carved. He tried a shallower scratch. Too faint. It disappeared during the crust expansion. He tried a star shape. Too complex. He tried a single line. Too ambiguous. Was it a crack or a mark? He tried a small X. Too symmetrical. On the 40th attempt, he found it. A cross, scratched at a 15-degree angle, 1 millimeter deep, positioned 3 centimeters from the edge of the loaf. After baking, it looked like a split in the crust caused by uneven heat. Unless you were searching for it, you would never notice. If you were searching for it, you would find it immediately. Henri baked 12 test loaves, 6 marked, 6 unmarked. He mixed them on his counter and stepped back. He asked Marguerite to identify the marked ones without touching them. She found 3 of 6. He adjusted the angle of the scratch. She found 5 of 6. He adjusted the depth. She found all 6. The system worked. On October 26, 1942, Simone delivered the first batch of operational maps. 10 silk sheets, each one printed with updated routes, new safe houses, and German checkpoint locations from the previous week. She told Henri the first delivery was scheduled for November 2nd at 5:30. A courier would arrive, collect the marked loaves, and transport them to the prison work camp, 15 kilometers east. Henri had 6 days. He baked at night. Marguerite locked the front door, pulled the curtains, and stood watch at the window while Henri worked in the back room. He prepared the dough at 2200, let it rise until 100, folded the chilled silk maps inside, shaped the loaves, and baked them between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock. By 5 o'clock, the map loaves were cool enough to handle. He marked the bottoms with a cross, placed them in a separate basket, and covered them with a cloth. The physical cost was immediate and cumulative. Henri worked from 4 o'clock to 22 o'clock 6 days per week running the bakery, serving customers, managing inventory, baking the daily 200 loaves for regular clients. Then he worked from 2200 to 500 baking map loaves in secret. 4 hours of sleep per night, 1 meal per day. By the second week, his wrists swelled from repetitive folding. By the third week, his lower back locked after standing for 18 hours. His hands trembled when shaping dough. Marguerite had to knead the final batches while he sat on a stool, too exhausted to stand. Luc, the 16-year-old apprentice, noticed. He began arriving 1 hour early to prepare the ovens without being asked. He never mentioned Henri's exhaustion. He never asked why Henri looked like he had not slept. He just worked. Years later, after the war, Luc would tell a reporter he had always known what Henri was doing. He said he had been too afraid to help. He said he thought about it every day until he died. November 2nd, 1942. The first delivery. Henri baked through the night. At 5:15, he placed 2 map loaves in a wicker basket and covered them with a linen towel. At 5:28, 3 knocks on the back door. Sharp, deliberate, 2 seconds apart. Henri opened the door. A man in a railway worker's uniform stood in the alley. He did not speak. He took the basket from Henri's hands and disappeared into the fog. Henri closed the door. He walked to the alley behind the bakery and vomited. His legs gave out. He sat on the ground, back against the wall, hands shaking so hard he could not light a cigarette. Marguerite found him there 10 minutes later. She gave him water and told him to breathe. He could not. His lungs pulled air in short, shallow gasps. Panic attack. She sat next to him and held his hand until his breathing slowed. He did not sleep that day. He lay in bed with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling, certain the Gestapo would arrive before nightfall. They did not. 3 weeks later, Simone knocked on the back door. She told Henri 2 prisoners had used his maps to escape. Both had reached Spain. She gave him 12 more silk sheets and said the next delivery was in 4 days. Henri baked. He delivered. He vomited. He did not sleep. The cycle repeated. December 1942. 8 map loaves delivered. 6 prisoners escaped. 2 were recaptured and shot. January 1943. 10 map loaves delivered. 8 prisoners escaped. 1 was killed during recapture. 1 froze to death in the Pyrenees. February 1943. 12 map loaves delivered. 11 prisoners escaped. 1 was caught at a checkpoint and executed. By March 1943, Henri had delivered 34 map loaves. 31 prisoners had escaped. 3 had been killed. Henri kept no written records. He memorized the numbers. Every night before sleeping, he counted 34 loaves, 31 escapees, 3 dead. He did not know their names. He did not know their ages or their families. He knew only that his bread had given them hope, and for 3 of them, hope had not been enough. The psychological cost was cumulative and irreversible. Henri began dreaming in German. He dreamed of Gestapo officers finding silk in his flour bins. He dreamed of Marguerite being dragged into the street. He dreamed of Luc hanging from a rope in the town square with a sign around his neck that said, "Traitor's accomplice." He woke at 3 o'clock every morning, drenched in sweat, certain he had been denounced. He would walk to the window and check the street for cars, for flashlights, for soldiers. Marguerite stopped asking if he was all right. She knew he was not. She held his hand in the dark and said nothing. By summer 1943, Henri's resting heart rate was 95 beats per minute. He had lost 8 kilograms. His hair had turned gray, but he continued baking. Lieutenant Robert Keane did not believe in bread. He was 23 years old, a navigator on a B-17 Flying Fortress, shot down over the English Channel on October 28, 1942. He had been captured 2 days later, soaked, hypothermic, and half-drowned, dragged from a tidal flat by a Wehrmacht patrol. Now, 6 days later, he sat in a converted barn, 12 kilometers east of Falaise, with 40 other Allied prisoners, eating a piece of bread that his commanding officer claimed contained a map. Captain William Lawson, British Army, 34 years old, had sliced open a loaf during the midday meal and found a sheet of silk folded inside. The silk was warm, slightly browned at the edges, printed with roads, rivers, rail lines, and tiny red dots marking safe houses across 200 kilometers of Norman countryside. Lawson had studied it for 3 minutes, memorizing landmarks, then burned it in a trash fire before the guards noticed. Keane thought it was insane. You could not bake a map. Fire destroyed paper. Everyone knew that. But Lawson was holding the ashes of something that had survived an oven, and Keane could not explain it any other way. That night, Keane and 2 others escaped during a shift change at 2200. They walked 18 kilometers south, following the route Lawson had memorized from the silk map. At 4 o'clock, they reached a farmhouse marked with a red dot. An old man opened the door, looked at them for 2 seconds, and pulled them inside without speaking. He hid them in a hayloft for 6 days. On the 7th day, he passed them to another resistance contact, a woman who transported them 40 kilometers west in the back of a vegetable truck. 3 weeks later, Keane crossed into Spain. On December 19, 1942, he wrote a report for British intelligence describing the map baked into bread. The report was filed in London and forgotten for 40 years. Henri baked his 10th map loaf on December 20, 1942, unaware that Keane had reached safety. Simone told him only that 2 prisoners had escaped. She never gave names. She never confirmed outcomes. Operational security. Henri understood. He did not ask. He just baked. By January 1943, Henri had refined the technique to 98% reliability. He could fold a silk map into dough in under 3 minutes. He could bake 6 map loaves per session, without visible difference from standard loaves. He varied delivery timing, alternating between Monday and Thursday mornings, to avoid establishing a pattern. He used 3 different couriers, all women, to minimize surveillance risk. He never asked their names. They never stayed longer than 30 seconds. The prisoners developed their own protocol. When a map loaf arrived, the senior officer would slice it open in private, study the map for no more than 5 minutes, brief 2 to 4 men on the escape route, and destroy the silk immediately by burning or shredding it into unrecognizable fragments. The selected men would memorize landmarks: a stone bridge 12 kilometers south, a church with a red roof 18 kilometers west, a barn with a collapsed north wall 25 kilometers southwest. They memorized distances estimated in walking hours. They memorized safe house locations marked with red dots and German checkpoint locations marked with black crosses. Then they waited. Some waited 2 weeks for the right work detail near a forest. Some waited 2 months for a night shift with a distracted guard. The success rate was 78%. 14 men were recaptured within 48 hours. 3 were executed on the spot. 49 reached neutral territory. By April 1943, Henri had delivered 47 map loaves. The Gestapo began investigating. They knew prisoners were escaping with detailed knowledge of local geography. Recaptured men described roads they had never seen, checkpoints they had never passed, and farmhouses they should not have known existed. The Gestapo interrogated farmers within 50 kilometers of Falaise. They checked travel permits. They searched homes, workshops, and vehicles. They found nothing. They did not search bakeries. Bread was too ordinary, too essential, too visible. The Gestapo assumed maps were being smuggled in toolkits, medical supplies, or laundry shipments. No one imagined a map could survive 190-degree heat inside an oven. Henri learned about the investigation in May 1943, when Simone knocked on his door and told him to stop baking for 8 weeks. The risk was too high. The Gestapo was close. Henri refused. Simone said the prisoners could wait. Henri said no, they could not. She said his family would be executed if he was caught. Henri said 14 men were already dead because they had waited too long. Simone stared at him for 10 seconds, then left without arguing further. Henri baked 3 map loaves that week. Something changed in Henri during that conversation. Marguerite noticed it first. He stopped flinching when German soldiers entered the bakery. He stopped checking the street for Gestapo cars at 3 o'clock. His hands stopped shaking during deliveries. Marguerite realized her husband had crossed a psychological threshold, where fear no longer controlled his decisions. He had become someone else, harder, quieter, more deliberate, someone who smiled at customers while calculating risk in fractional percentages. She did not know if she would ever get the old Henri back. She suspected she would not. By June 1943, Henri had baked 55 map loaves. 50 prisoners had escaped. 43 had reached safety. 7 had died during recapture or in transit. Henri memorized every number. He thought about the 7 dead men every night. He did not know their names, their faces, or their families. He knew only that his bread had carried them toward freedom, and somewhere along the route, freedom had killed them. In July 1943, a new prisoner arrived at the camp, Flight Lieutenant Thomas Harrow, RAF, 26 years old, shot down over Caen. Harrow had been a baker's apprentice in civilian life before the war. On his 3rd day at the camp, A marked loaf arrived with the bread ration. Harrow sliced it open, found the silk map, and stared at it for 5 full minutes. Then he looked at Captain Lawson and said, "Whoever baked this is a master. You cannot hide silk in dough without tearing it. The temperature alone should destroy it. This is perfect." Lawson asked if Harrow thought it could be replicated. Harrow said no. It required too much skill, too much precision, and access to an oven. The Germans were not watching. Whoever was doing this, Harrow said, was risking execution every time they baked, and they were doing it anyway. Harrow escaped 4 weeks later, using Henri's map. He reached England in September 1943. He never learned the baker's name. By September 1943, Henri had baked 63 map loaves. 63 prisoners had escaped using his maps. 54 had reached neutral territory. 9 had been killed. Henri kept baking. He did not know the Gestapo had already begun watching the bread deliveries. He did not know they were photographing every basket, tracking every courier, counting every loaf. He did not know that in 6 months, a detective named Klaus Renner would find a pattern in the photographs that would lead him directly to the bakery on Rue Saint-Laurent. Henri only knew that men were still trapped, and bread could still save them. So he baked. Hauptsturmführer Klaus Renner did not believe in coincidences. He was 37 years old, formerly a police detective in Hamburg, transferred to Normandy in 1941 to investigate resistance activity. He had interrogated 80 suspected operatives in 2 years. He had arrested 34. He had executed 12. He was methodical, patient, and suspicious of patterns that other men dismissed as luck. By October 1943, he had noticed something that did not make sense. Prisoners escaping from the Falaise area knew too much. They knew the locations of German checkpoints they had never seen. They avoided roads that had been mined 3 days earlier. They walked directly to farmhouses 30 kilometers away without asking for directions. Recaptured men described landmarks with precision. A stone bridge 12 kilometers south, a church with a red roof 18 kilometers west, a barn with a collapsed north wall. They should not have known these things. They were held in camps, transported under guard, and worked on road details under constant supervision. They had no access to maps. They had no contact with civilians. Yet they navigated occupied France like men who had studied the terrain for months. Renner concluded they were receiving maps, detailed, updated, and accurate enough to guide men across 200 kilometers of hostile territory. He began interviewing recaptured prisoners in November 1943. Most refused to speak. 3 admitted they had memorized routes from a map. None would say where the map came from. One prisoner, a Canadian pilot named Morrison, 28 years old, shot down over Caen in August, said something strange during interrogation. Renner asked where he had obtained the map. Morrison, delirious from 3 days without water, said, "It was baked into something." Renner wrote the phrase in his notebook and underlined it twice. He asked Morrison to clarify. Morrison passed out. Renner had him revived with cold water and questioned him again. Morrison said nothing else. He was executed the next morning before Renner could continue the interrogation. Baked into something. Renner dismissed it as delirium. Maps were paper. Paper burned. Everyone knew that. But the phrase stayed in his mind like a splinter. He spent the next month searching print shops, tailor workshops, and cobblers who might be forging documents or sewing maps into clothing. He found nothing. He expanded his search to blacksmiths, carpenters, and leather workers. Nothing. By December 1943, Renner had searched 40 businesses and arrested 6 people for unrelated infractions. He had found no maps. On December 18, 1943, Renner changed his approach. He stopped looking for the maps and started looking at the supply chain. Every prisoner work camp in Normandy received daily deliveries: food, tools, medical supplies, and clothing. Renner compiled a list of every contractor who delivered to the camps within 50 kilometers of Falaise. The list contained 47 businesses, 12 bakeries, 8 butchers, 6 vegetable suppliers, 5 dairies, 4 tool suppliers, 3 clothing vendors, 9 miscellaneous contractors. Renner assigned plainclothes officers to photograph every delivery to every camp for 3 months. No searches, no interrogations, just observation and documentation. By March 1944, Renner had 1,200 photographs. He studied them alone in his office for 2 days, sorting them by date, camp, and supplier. He was looking for anomalies, something that appeared once and disappeared, something that repeated in a pattern, something too small for guards to notice but large enough to matter. On March 10, 1944, at 1400, Renner found it. In 18 photographs taken over 6 months, bread loaves in delivery baskets were positioned differently from the rest. Most loaves were stacked normally, crust side up, but in 18 instances, a small number of loaves, usually 2 or 3, were placed bottom up, their crusts facing downward. Renner cross-referenced the dates of these deliveries with recorded escape attempts. 17 of the 18 dates coincided with escapes within 72 hours. Renner placed the 18 photographs side by side on his desk. He studied the baskets. The bottom-up loaves were always smaller than the others. They were always positioned on top of the stack, easily accessible. They were delivered by 3 different couriers, all women, all employed by bakeries in Falaise. One bakery appeared in 14 of the 18 photographs: Henri Beaumont, Rue Saint-Laurent, Falaise. Renner checked the bakery's records. It had been requisitioned by the Wehrmacht in June 1940. It supplied bread to the German garrison and to the civilian population. The owner was Henri Beaumont, 52 years old, married, no criminal record, no political affiliations. A baker, ordinary, invisible. Renner studied the photographs again. He noticed something else. In 6 of the 14 deliveries from Beaumont's bakery, the bottom crusts of the upside-down loaves were visible in the frame. Renner used a magnifying glass. On 4 of the 6 loaves, he could see a faint mark on the crust. A small cross, scratched at an angle, barely visible unless you were looking for it. Renner sat back in his chair and stared at the photographs for 10 minutes without moving. Then he stood up, walked to his superior's office, and requested a search warrant for Henri Beaumont. The warrant was approved in 20 minutes. On March 12, 1944, at 14:30, Renner and 4 officers entered the bakery. Marguerite Beaumont was at the counter, serving a customer. Henri Beaumont was in the back room, shaping dough. Renner presented the warrant and told Marguerite to sit. He told Henri to step away from the ovens. 2 officers began searching the storeroom, opening cupboards, dumping flour sacks onto the floor, checking shelves and drawers. They found nothing. Renner walked to the front counter. 15 loaves of bread were stacked on a wooden tray, waiting for customer pickup. Renner picked up the first loaf and sliced it lengthwise with a knife from the counter. Normal. He picked up the second loaf. Normal. The third loaf. Normal. The 4th, 5th, 6th. All normal. He picked up the 7th loaf. It was slightly smaller than the others. He turned it over. There was a faint cross scratched into the bottom crust, positioned 3 centimeters from the edge, angled at 15 degrees. Renner placed the loaf on the counter and sliced it lengthwise. The knife stopped. His blade caught on something that was not dough. He pulled it out slowly. A sheet of silk, 18 centimeters square, printed with roads, rail lines, safe houses, and German checkpoints. He held it up to the light. The silk was warm, slightly browned at the edges, but perfectly legible. Renner turned toward Henri Beaumont. Henri's vision tunneled, his ears filled with a sound like rushing water. His bladder released 3 drops of urine into his trousers. He could not move. He could not breathe. He watched Renner hold the silk up to the window and study it with the calm, deliberate focus of a man who had just solved a problem that had consumed him for 6 months. Renner placed the silk on the counter and asked Henri a question in German. "How many have you baked?" Henri did not speak German. He stood 3 meters away, flour on his hands, staring at the map on the counter. He did not answer. Renner asked again, slower this time, enunciating each word. Henri said nothing. Renner walked toward him and stopped 1 meter away. He looked at Henri's hands. They were shaking. He looked at Henri's face. No expression. He looked at Henri's eyes. Fear, but something else underneath it. Not defiance, not guilt. Something harder. Resignation. Renner said in French this time, "You will tell me how many. You will tell me who gave you the maps. You will tell me who delivered them." Henri said nothing. Marguerite stood up from her chair. Renner told her to sit. She did not sit. She walked toward her husband. One of the officers grabbed her arm and pulled her back. She did not resist. She looked at Henri. He looked at her. Neither spoke. Renner told his officers to arrest them both. Henri Beaumont was taken to Gestapo headquarters in Caen at 1600 on March 12, 1944. Marguerite was held in a separate cell for questioning. At 1800, Renner began the interrogation. He asked Henri for the names of the couriers. Henri said nothing. Renner asked for the names of resistance contacts. Henri said nothing. Renner asked how many loaves he had baked. Henri said nothing. At 1930, Renner broke 2 of Henri's fingers with a wooden baton. Henri screamed. He passed out. He was revived with cold water. Renner asked again. Henri said nothing. At 2100, Renner broke 3 of Henri's ribs. Henri vomited. He could not breathe without pain. He could not stand. 2 officers held him upright in the chair. Renner asked again. Henri said nothing. At 2300, after 5 hours of interrogation, Renner realized Henri Beaumont would die before speaking. He stopped the session and scheduled an execution. Marguerite was released without charge at midnight. Renner told her that her husband had been caught aiding enemy forces. He told her Henri would be executed within 90 days. He told her she could not see him, write to him, or send him anything. Marguerite walked home alone through empty streets. She did not cry. She opened the bakery the next morning at 6 o'clock and served bread to the German garrison as if nothing had changed. In August 2001, a construction crew demolishing a former Gestapo detention facility in Caen broke through a basement wall and found a metal box buried inside the bricks. The box contained interrogation records from 1943 to 1944. Typed transcripts, black and white photographs, and execution orders signed by officers who had been dead for 50 years. One file was labeled Beaumont Henri, Case 4471B. It contained 12 pages of typed testimony, a single photograph, and a death certificate. The testimony described 18 months of clandestine map production, 63 loaves baked, 54 prisoners escaped, 9 killed during recapture or in transit. The photograph showed a man, shirtless, bruised across the chest and shoulders, staring at the camera without expression. His face was gaunt. His eyes were flat. He looked like someone who had already died. The death certificate was dated June 6, 1944. Cause of death: execution by firing squad. Charges: collaboration with enemy forces, aiding escaped prisoners, espionage. The file was forwarded to the French National Archives in Paris. A historian named Dr. Maurice Blanc, researching Normandy resistance networks, found it in 1982 while cross-referencing recently declassified British intelligence reports. One report, written by Lieutenant Robert Keane in December 1942, described a silk map hidden inside a loaf of bread, delivered to a prisoner work camp near Falaise. Blanc matched the report to the Gestapo file. He contacted the Falaise Municipal Records Office and requested information on Henri Beaumont's surviving family. There was one living relative, Claudette Beaumont, 72 years old, living in Paris. Blanc called her on October 14, 1982. Claudette had not heard her father's name spoken aloud in 15 years. She told Blanc her father had been executed as a traitor in 1944. She said her mother had told her he had hoarded flour and sold it on the black market. She said she had not visited his grave in 20 years. Blanc asked if he could meet her. Claudette said no. Blanc said he had documents proving her father had saved 54 lives. Claudette hung up. Blanc sent the Gestapo file to her apartment by registered mail. Claudette received it 3 days later. She did not open it for a week. When she finally did, she read it 3 times without stopping. Then she sat at her kitchen table and stared at the photograph of her father for 40 minutes. She had believed he was a collaborator for 38 years. Henri Beaumont had been held in a Gestapo detention cell in Cannes from March 12, 1944, until his execution on June 6, 1944. He shared the cell with 9 other condemned prisoners, 7 French resistance operatives, 1 British commando, and 1 American pilot. He slept on concrete. He received 1 meal per day, 400 grams of bread and watered soup. His ribs did not heal. He coughed blood for 3 weeks. His broken fingers turned black and had to be amputated without anesthesia on April 22, 1944. On May 15, 1944, a priest visited the cell and offered last rites to the condemned men. Henri refused. The priest asked if he wanted to send a message to his family. Henri said no. The priest asked if he wanted absolution. Henri said no. The priest asked why. Henri said, "I do not regret what I did." The priest left. Henri died 22 days later. On the morning of June 6, 1944, while Allied forces landed on beaches 60 kilometers north, Henri Beaumont and 11 other prisoners were taken to a courtyard behind the detention facility. They were lined up against a brick wall. A firing squad of 8 soldiers stood 10 meters away. An officer read the charges. Henri did not listen. He looked at the sky. It was clear. He could hear artillery fire in the distance, faint but constant. He knew what it meant. He closed his eyes. The execution was carried out at 5 o'clock. Henri Beaumont died at age 52, 86 days after his arrest. Allied forces liberated Caen 32 days later. Marguerite Beaumont received a death notice on June 10, 1944. It stated her husband had been executed for crimes against the occupation. It did not specify the crimes. It did not mention the maps, the escapes, or the 54 men who had reached freedom because of bread. Marguerite read the notice once, folded it, and placed it in a drawer. She told her 2 adult children that their father had been arrested for hoarding flour and selling it illegally. She told the town the same story. She reopened the bakery in August 1944 with Luc, the 16-year-old apprentice who had always arrived early and never asked questions. She never spoke about Henri's work. When customers asked how he died, she said, "The war took him," and changed the subject. When her daughter, Claudette, asked if her father had been a traitor, Marguerite said, "Your father did what he thought was right." Claudette interpreted this as confirmation. She believed her father had collaborated with the Germans, that he had sold them bread and information, and that the resistance had executed him for it. She did not visit his grave. She married in 1946, had 3 children, and moved to Paris. She rarely returned to Falaise. When she did, she avoided the bakery. In 1965, Marguerite Beaumont died of pneumonia. She was 70 years old. She left no letters, no diaries, no written explanation of what Henri had done. She was buried next to her husband in the Falaise cemetery. Claudette attended the funeral, left the same day, and never returned. For 17 years, Claudette Beaumont believed her father was a traitor, and her mother had protected his memory out of shame. On October 20th, 1982, 6 days after receiving the Gestapo file, Claudette took a train to Falaise. She walked to the cemetery and stood in front of her father's grave for the first time in 20 years. The headstone said, Henri Beaumont, 1892 to 1944. Beloved husband and father. Nothing else. No mention of service, no mention of sacrifice, just a name and 2 dates. Claudette placed a small loaf of bread on the headstone. She stood there for 40 minutes, not crying, not praying, just standing. A reporter from the local newspaper saw her and took a photograph without asking permission. The photograph appeared on the front page the next day with the headline, "The Baker's Daughter Returns." Claudette gave one interview. She said her father had been a quiet man who loved his work. She said she wished she had known the truth earlier. She said she would not forgive her mother for the silence. When the reporter asked what she meant, Claudette said, "My mother knew. She knew for 40 years and never told me. She let me believe he was a traitor. I do not understand why." Claudette returned to Paris and never visited Falaise again. She died in 1991 at age 79. She never reconciled with the silence. In 1995, the French government awarded Henri Beaumont a posthumous Croix de Guerre for his contribution to the resistance. The ceremony was held in Falaise. No family attended. Claudette had died 4 years earlier. Henri's son, Louis, declined the invitation and sent a one-sentence letter. "My father's name means nothing to me." Luc Moreau, the former apprentice, attended. He was 69 years old, retired, living in Caen. A reporter asked him if he had known what Henri was doing during the war. Luc said yes. The reporter asked why he had not helped. Luc said, "I was afraid." The reporter asked if he regretted it. Luc said, "Every day." He died 6 months later. The numbers are precise and final. Henri Beaumont baked 63 map loaves between November 1942 and March 1944. 54 Allied prisoners used those maps to reach neutral territory. 9 were killed during recapture or execution. Henri was tortured for 5 hours, imprisoned for 86 days, and executed at age 52 on the morning of the Allied invasion. His family believed he was a traitor for 38 years. His daughter avoided his grave for 20 years. His wife protected a secret no one asked her to protect for 40 years, then died without explaining why. The maps Henri baked saved 54 lives. The silence around his death destroyed 3 generations of his family. There is no equation that balances those numbers. There is no story that makes them mean one thing. Henri Beaumont did not die a hero. He died alone, in pain, believing his family would never know what he had done. Marguerite Beaumont did not die a guardian of truth. She died silent, believing silence was protection. Claudette Beaumont did not die reconciled. She died angry, believing her mother had chosen shame over honesty. The bakery still stands on Rue Saint-Laurent in Falaise. It sells bread 6 days a week. There is no plaque, no marker, no indication that 80 years ago, something impossible was baked there. The new owners do not know the history. The customers do not ask. 54 men walked out of occupied France because of bread. 9 men died trying. 1 man was executed for baking it. 3 generations of his family were destroyed by the silence that followed. There is no moral to this story. There is only the fact of it. There is no equation that balances 54 saved lives against 3 generations destroyed by silence. There is no story that makes Henri Beaumont's choices mean one thing. History is not clean. It does not resolve. It just ends. That is what we document here, the unresolved, the uncomfortable, The stories that do not fit heroic narratives. One per week. Verified sources, no propaganda. If you want more of these, subscribe. If this one challenged you, leave a like. And here's the question. If you were Marguerite, would you have stayed silent to protect your daughter? Write your answer below. There is no right one.